A wheelchair rolls into a storm of injustice. Terry Sloan faces a ruthless HOA enforcer who scoffs at his rights. Will one man's defiance rewrite the rules? You won't believe what happens next in this Tacoma showdown. Watch now. Don't miss the fight that changes everything. Disabled parking's a privilege, not a right, Brad Coleman sneered, slapping a neon orange ticket onto Terry Sloan's windshield. The Tacoma rain drummed on the hood, blurring the world beyond the lot. Terry, 46, sat in his wheelchair, his jaw tight, eyes locked on the ticket flapping in the wind. The blue disability placard hung clearly in his window, its edges worn but valid. He'd parked here, in the designated spot outside his apartment complex, for years without issue. Now this. Terry was no stranger to confrontation. A specialist in disability law, he'd spent 2 decades dismantling barriers with the precision of a surgeon. His office, a cluttered nook in downtown Tacoma, overflowed with case files and dog-eared copies of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Principled to a fault, Terry lived by rules, his own and the law's. But Brad, the new HOA security officer, was a storm of his own making. At 37, with a temper as sharp as his buzz cut, Brad patrolled the complex like a general, his radio crackling with self-importance. To him, Terry's van was an eyesore, disability or not. The ticket read, "Parked over 72 hours." A lie. Terry had moved the van yesterday to meet Michelle Rivers, his old high school friend and a freelance journalist with a nose for injustice. They'd grabbed coffee at a diner on Pacific Avenue, where Michelle, 40, her auburn hair tucked behind her ears, had grilled him about the HOA's latest overreaches. "They're bullies, Terry," she'd said, her pen tapping her notebook. "You should dig into their rules." He'd shrugged, not yet smelling a fight. Now, staring at Brad's scrawl on the ticket, he felt the spark. Terry wheeled back to his apartment, the ticket clutched in his hand. The complex, a squat brick building off 6th Avenue, was home to retirees, young families, and a growing tension. The HOA, led by a faceless board, had tightened its grip lately. New fines, stricter parking, petty power plays. Terry's neighbors whispered complaints but feared retaliation. He didn't. Opening his laptop, he pulled up the HOA's bylaws, cross-referencing them with federal law. The ticket wasn't just wrong, it was illegal. The ADA protected his right to park indefinitely in a designated spot. No time limits. By midnight, Terry's desk was a war zone of legal pads and coffee mugs. He'd found 3 violations in the HOA's parking policy alone. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, drafting an email to the board. But this wasn't enough. Brad's smirk. The ticket's bold lie. It was personal. Terry leaned back, the hum of Tacoma's night traffic filtering through his window. He'd take this beyond the board. He'd make them answer in public. The next morning, Terry called Michelle. "I need you to do what you do best," he said, his voice steady but burning. "Write about this. All of it." Michelle, already intrigued, agreed to meet him at the community center where the HOA held its monthly meetings. She sensed a story, one that could ripple beyond Tacoma. Terry hung up, his mind racing. This wasn't just about a ticket anymore. It was about respect, about every time someone looked at his wheelchair and saw less. As Terry prepared for the fight, Brad was across town, oblivious, issuing another ticket to a neighbor's car. His radio buzzed with a colleague's voice. "Sloan's asking questions." Brad snorted, tossing the ticket onto the dash. "Let him. He's got no legs to stand on." The rain kept falling, and Tacoma held its breath. The community center on South 9th Street buzzed with restless energy. Folding chairs squeaked as neighbors shifted, their murmurs blending with the hum of a faulty heater. Terry Sloan wheeled through the entrance, his navy suit crisp against the worn linoleum. The HOA meeting was about to start, and he carried a folder thick with evidence, bylaws, federal statutes, and a copy of the ticket that had ignited this war. Michelle Rivers followed, her trench coat damp from the Tacoma drizzle, her notebook already open. The room felt like a courtroom, and Terry was ready to prosecute. The issue wasn't just his van anymore. Since the ticket, Terry had spoken to neighbors who'd faced Brad's wrath. Midrepun Alvarez, fined for her grandson's bike on the sidewalk. Mr. Chen, cited for a planter obstructing a walkway. The HOA's rules, enforced by Brad's heavy hand, were suffocating the complex. Terry's fight had become theirs. Though most were too scared to speak, his resolve hardened with every whispered story. But the weight of their fear pressed on him. If he failed, the HOA would tighten its grip further. At the front, the HOA board sat behind a long table, their faces a mask of practiced neutrality. Brad stood to the side, arms crossed, his security uniform starched to perfection. He caught Terry's eye and smirked, as if daring him to try. The board president, a gray-haired woman named Evelyn Hart, called the meeting to order. "Public comments are limited to 3 minutes," she said, her voice clipped. Terry raised his hand, and the room stilled. "Mr. Sloan," Evelyn said, glancing at her watch. "Proceed." Terry's voice was calm but unyielding. "Your parking policy violates federal law. The ADA guarantees my right to park in a designated spot without time restrictions. Your officer's ticket," he held up the orange slip, "is illegal. So are your bylaws." He slid his folder across the table, pages marked with highlighted clauses. The board members exchanged glances, but Evelyn's expression didn't flicker. "We'll review this," she said, her tone dismissive. "Next speaker." The brush-off stung, but Terry expected it. What he didn't expect was Brad's move. As the meeting droned on, Brad stepped forward during a discussion about landscaping fees. "While we're on violations," he said, his voice loud, "Sloan's van is a safety hazard. It blocks emergency access." A lie and a bold one. The room erupted in whispers. Terry's hands tightened on his wheels. Brad was escalating, painting him as a threat to the community. Michelle leaned toward Terry, her pen scratching furiously. "He's baiting you," she whispered. "Don't take it." But Terry's pulse pounded. He'd spent years advocating for access, for dignity, only to be smeared in his own home. He wheeled forward again, ignoring Evelyn's gavel. "That's a false claim," he said, his voice cutting through the noise. "My van meets all codes. You're deflecting because you know you're wrong." The crowd shifted, some nodding, others averting their eyes. Brad's smirk faltered, but only for a second. The twist came after the meeting. As Terry and Michelle exited into the rainy night, a young woman approached. A neighbor, Lena, barely 25, clutching a manila envelope. "I heard you tonight," she said, her voice low. "You're not the only one they've targeted." She handed Terry the envelope, her hands trembling. Inside were internal HOA emails, leaked by a disgruntled clerk. They revealed a pattern. The board had instructed Brad to crack down on problem residents, with Terry's name at the top of the list. One email from Evelyn herself read, "Sloan's trouble. Make it costly for him." Terry's breath caught. This wasn't just Brad's vendetta, it was a coordinated campaign. The HOA wanted him silenced, maybe even pushed out. The revelation hit like a punch, but it also lit a fire. He looked at Michelle, who was already scanning the emails with a reporter's hunger. "This is bigger than a ticket," she said, rain streaking her glasses. "We can blow this wide open." Back at his apartment, Terry spread the emails across his desk, his mind racing. The HOA's actions weren't just illegal, they were personal. A deliberate attack on his rights and his home. His neighbors' faces flashed in his mind. Mrs. Alvarez's worry, Mr. Chen's resignation. He felt the weight of their trust, and it steadied him. But the stakes were higher now. If the HOA was this brazen, they'd fight dirty to protect themselves. Across town, Brad met Evelyn in a dimly lit diner, his fingers drumming on the table. "Sloan's got people talking," he said, his voice low. "We need to shut this down." Evelyn sipped her coffee, her eyes cold. "Then make sure he has no allies." she said. Find leverage. Everyone's got something to lose. The rain battered the diner's windows, and the plot against Terry tightened. Terry Sloan's apartment had become a command center. The dining table, once reserved for solitary dinners, was buried under stacks of legal documents, printed emails, and Michelle Rivers' handwritten notes. The leaked HOA emails had cracked open a truth Terry hadn't fully grasped. The board, led by Evelyn Hart, wasn't just negligent, they were predatory, targeting anyone who dared question their authority. Terry's fight was no longer about a single ticket. It was about dismantling a system that thrived on intimidation. His resolve burned brighter, but so did his exhaustion. Nights blurred into mornings, and the weight of his neighbors' hopes pressed harder. Michelle, sprawled on Terry's couch, typed furiously on her laptop. "This goes beyond Tacoma," she said, her voice sharp with conviction. "I've got a contact at the News Tribune. They'll eat this up." Her story, still in draft, outlined the HOA's violations and named Terry as the whistleblower. But publishing carried risks. The HOA could retaliate legally or worse. Terry nodded, his eyes fixed on an email from Evelyn. "Sloan's trouble. Make it costly." The words stung, not just for their venom, but for what they implied. He wasn't just a target, he was a symbol of everything the HOA feared. Resistance was billing, but it was fragile. Lena, the neighbor who'd leaked the emails, had stopped answering Terry's calls, spooked by a late-night visit from Brad. "He didn't say much," she'd whispered in a voicemail. "But he was at my door, just standing there." Other neighbors, emboldened by Terry's stand at the meeting, began sharing their own stories, fines for minor infractions, threats of liens, even hints of eviction. Mrs. Alvarez confessed she'd paid $200 to avoid a hearing over her grandson's bike. "They know I can't fight," she said. "Das thing," she said, her voice trembling. Terry's chest tightened. He'd promised to protect them, but the HOA's reach was longer than he'd imagined. The revelation came at a coffee shop on Pacific Avenue, where Terry and Michelle met a new ally, Daniel Kim, a former HOA treasurer who'd quit 6 months earlier. Daniel, a wiry man in his 50s, slid into the booth, his hands fidgeting. "I left because I saw too much," he said, glancing over his shoulder. He produced a USB drive, its contents a bombshell. Financial records showing the HOA had misallocated funds meant for maintenance. Instead of fixing leaky roofs or upgrading accessibility ramps, Evelyn had funneled money into legal fees to silence dissenters. One line item stood out, a $5,000 payment to a private investigator, dated a week before Terry's ticket. "They were watching you," Daniel said, his voice low. "Before the ticket, before the meeting, they knew you'd fight back." Terry's hands clenched around his coffee mug. The ticket wasn't random, it was a trap. Bait to provoke him into a fight they thought they could win. Michelle's eyes widened as she skimmed the records on her laptop. "This is fraud," she said, "and it's provable." The shift in power was palpable. Terry wasn't just a lone advocate anymore. He had evidence that could topple the board. But the HOA wasn't idle. Brad, acting on Evelyn's orders, had begun digging into Terry's life. At the complex, he cornered Mr. Chen, demanding details about Terry's habits. "He's stirring trouble," Brad said, his voice a low growl. "You want to stay on the right side of this?" Mr. Chen rattled, said nothing, but the encounter spread fear. Meanwhile, Evelyn met with a lawyer in a sleek office downtown, crafting a defamation suit against Terry and Michelle. "We'll bury them in paperwork," she said, her lips curling. The HOA's desperation was clear. They were losing control, and they knew it. Terry felt the walls closing in. His phone buzzed with messages from neighbors, some supportive, others panicked. One from an anonymous number read, "Back off or it gets worse." He showed it to Michelle, who frowned but didn't flinch. "They're scared," she said. "That's why they're doing this." Terry nodded, but doubt gnawed at him. He'd built his life on principle, on the law's clarity. But this fight was messier, uglier. If he pushed forward, he risked everything. his home, his neighbor's safety, even his reputation. That night, alone in his apartment, Terry wheeled to the window, staring at Tacoma's rain-slicked streets. The city's lights blurred through the glass, a reminder of the world beyond this fight. He thought of his younger self, the man who'd learned to navigate a world not built for him, who'd turned his anger into advocacy. That man wouldn't back down. He opened his laptop and began drafting a formal complaint to the Department of Justice, citing the HOA's ADA violations and financial misconduct. The fight was far from over, but Terry was ready to escalate. Across town, Brad tossed a file onto Evelyn's desk, a triumphant glint in his eye. "Found something," he said. "Sloan's not as clean as he thinks." The rain fell harder, and the battle lines deepened. The Tacoma Community Center was packed, its fluorescent lights casting stark shadows on the crowd. Terry Sloan wheeled to the front, his suit impeccable, his eyes blazing with purpose. The emergency HOA meeting, called after Michelle's expose hit the News Tribune, was a reckoning. Her article, headlined "Tacoma HOA's Illegal Crackdown," had detailed the board's ADA violations, financial fraud, and targeting of Terry. It sparked outrage, drawing neighbors, reporters, and even a DOJ investigator to the room. The air crackled with anticipation, and Terry felt the weight of every gaze. Evelyn Hart sat at the board's table, her face a mask of forced calm. Brad Coleman stood nearby, his security uniform rumpled, his usual swagger gone. The file he'd given Evelyn, old medical records suggesting Terry had once contested a disability claim, hadn't worked. Michelle had debunked it as irrelevant, and the DOJ dismissed it as a distraction. Brad's attempt to smear Terry had only deepened the HOA's hole. Now they faced a room ready to erupt. Terry spoke first, his voice steady but resonant. "You violated federal law. You targeted me, my neighbors, and this community. You thought we'd stay quiet." He held up the leaked emails and financial records, now public thanks to Daniel Kim's courage. "You stole from us, you bullied us, but we're done." The crowd roared, Mrs. Alvarez clapping fiercely, Mr. Chen nodding from the back. Lena, no longer hiding, stood with her arms crossed, defiant. Terry's heart swelled. He wasn't alone anymore. Evelyn tried to interrupt, her voice shrill. "These are baseless accusations." But the DOJ investigator, a woman in a sharp blazer, raised a hand. "We've reviewed the evidence," she said. "Your board is under investigation for ADA violations and financial misconduct." The room gasped. Evelyn's composure cracked, her hands trembling as she clutched her notes. Brad shifted, his eyes darting to the exit, but a neighbor blocked his path. Shaking her head, the power had shifted, and the HOA's reign was crumbling. Michelle, stationed near the breaker, dimmed the lights and displayed the financial records on a screen, line by line. She exposed the misallocated funds, money for ramps diverted to legal fees, maintenance budgets siphoned for Evelyn's pet projects. The crowd's anger surged, voices shouting questions. A retiree stood, pointing at Evelyn. "You let my roof leak while you paid lawyers to harass Terry?" Evelyn stammered, but no answer came. Brad, cornered, muttered, "I just followed orders." The excuse landed like a confession, and the room turned on him. The climax came when Terry presented his demand, a public apology, policy reform, and compensation for every fined resident. He'd filed his DOJ complaint, but this was personal. "You don't get to hide," Woody said, locking eyes with Evelyn. "Admit what you did." The investigator nodded, signaling the board had little choice. Evelyn, her face pale, stood. "We regret any oversights," she began, but the crowd booed. Under pressure, she choked out, "We're sorry. We'll comply." It wasn't heartfelt, but it was enough. The room erupted in cheers, neighbors hugging, some wiping tears. Brad's fall was quieter but no less final. The investigator questioned him on the spot, citing witness accounts of his intimidation tactics. Stripped of his authority, he resigned that night, leaving Tacoma under cover of darkness. Evelyn and the board stepped down days later, replaced by a new slate, including Lena, who vowed transparency. The HOA rewrote its bylaws, aligning with federal law, and issued refunds for every unjust fine. Terry's van, once a target, became a symbol of victory, parked proudly in its designated spot. As the meeting ended, Michelle pulled Terry aside, her smile wide. "You did it," she said, her notebook finally closed. "This story's going national." Terry exhaled, the tension in his shoulders easing. He looked at his neighbors, their faces lit with hope, and felt something deeper than triumph. Connection. He'd fought for himself, but he'd won for them all. Weeks later, Terry sat in his apartment, a letter from the DOJ confirming the HOA's penalties on his desk. The rain had stopped, and Tacoma's sky was clear, a rare blue. He wheeled to his window, watching kids play in the complex courtyard, their laughter echoing. Mrs. Alvarez waved from her balcony, her grandson's bike parked without fear. Terry smiled, his principles intact, his community whole. The fight had changed him, sharpening his belief in the law's power to protect. He'd already begun advising other complexes, his office now a hub for advocacy. Michelle's article, syndicated across Washington, had made him a local hero, though he shrugged off the title. For Terry, it was simple. Rules mattered, and so did respect. As he turned from the window, his phone buzzed. A new case. Another fight. He answered, ready. Terry Sloan's battle against an unjust HOA exposed truth and sparked change in Tacoma. From a single parking ticket to a public reckoning, his story inspires. Thank you for watching. Like, subscribe, and comment to join the fight for justice. Don't miss our next story. Hit that bell.